It seems like just yesterday, Brazil was soaring. It was one of those BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, that were going to take the 21st century by storm. But Brazil's economy is contracting, and a corruption scandal threatens to take down its president imminently. All this with the Summer Olympics in Rio less than 100 days away. Joining us now for a look at Brazil, in Washington, D.C., Monica de Bolli, a fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And here in our studio, Dan Jackson, filmmaker whose documentary In the Shadow of the Hill looks at how Brazil's police force dealt with those living in its largest slum in the lead up to the 2014 World Cup. Dan, it's great to have you here. I've seen the documentary. It's just fantastic. Congratulations on getting that done. Monica, I'm happy to have you on TVO with us tonight as well. And let's share these facts about Brazil before we have our discussion here. Population north of 200 million people in Brazil, a GDP of 1.8 trillion. The growth rate? No growth. Declining, minus 3% last year. The population below the poverty line is more than 1 in 5 people, all of that according to the CIA World Factbook. Dan, sit tight for a second, because I just want to talk to Monica off the top here and get sort of an update on the political nature of Brazil's crisis right now. The president of Brazil is in the process of being impeached, and the country is in political turmoil right now. Monica, just give us some of the background. Why has this happened?
Well, there are a number of reasons. The first and most important reason is that there have been a number of things that have come to light with respect to, the president and her involvement in several things, including possibly, though this is not the basis of the impeachment petition, but possibly some links to the corruption scandal coming out of the oil company Petrobras. The basis of the impeachment petition, however, has to do with violation of Brazil's fiscal responsibility laws. But it's important to understand that all of this comes at a time when the president's approval ratings are at an all-time low. Obviously, part of that is because of the economy and the fact that, as you mentioned before, the country's in recession. Unemployment is extremely high. It has already reached double digits. It's at 11% in Brazil. Wages are falling. So, in other words, people are suffering, and this is of course a direct reflection of the president's lack of popularity. But this is not just a popularity context. I mean, in a lot of ways, there is a lot of dissatisfaction with respect to the president herself and to her involvement, direct or indirect, in this whole scandal that swamped the country in the last year and a half.
Corruption is a theme that obviously runs through politics in Brazil, and Dan, as you show in your documentary, it runs through law enforcement as well. We want to show a clip from your documentary, and then we'll come back and chat about that, okay? Sheldon, if you would, let's roll that, please.
Só para fazer uma síntese do que está acontecendo hoje no Rio de Janeiro. Entre janeiro de 2007 e dezembro de 2013, houve 38 mil casos de desaparecimento. Que a região metropolitana do Rio de Janeiro está coalhada de cemitérios clandestinos. É informação importante, o perfil são, em geral, jovens, negros, pardos, do sexo masculino, moradores de comunidade pobre.
Eu estou defendendo que a polícia hoje, ela desaparece mais com as mortes, porque não entra numa estatística de morte da polícia, mas no desaparecido. Tem um depoimento de um policial recente que ele diz exatamente isso. A gente não deixa mais o rastro do crime. Leva para o rio e joga fora.
Just some spectacular shots in that documentary of yours, Dan.
Thanks, Dave.
Tell us more, first of all, about where your documentary is located.
It's located in Rio de Janeiro's most populous slum, Rocinha, which is actually straddled by two of Rio de Janeiro's most wealthy suburbs.
Those high shots that you take of it, though, bright, beautiful colored homes. It looks gorgeous. You'd never know that it was a slum where people are really living cheek by jowl, right?
It's certainly a very picturesque place from certain angles, but once you get deep into the community, you see quite plainly the other side of existence in the community.
Now, we talked about political corruption with Monica, but this is clearly corruption based around what the police claim is an attempt by them to rid the community that you focused on here of drug traffickers who they say run amok in there. What have you found out about whether that's an accurate claim?
Well, I mean, the pacification programs were put into place shortly after the announcement that Brazil would host the World Cup, and shortly thereafter the Summer Olympics. Now, essentially, what happened was the police went into a number of Brazil's favelas and
what's a favela?
A favela is it's a slum essentially. To set up a permanent presence in there and to get the drug traffickers out of the territory. Essentially, it was all about reclaiming territory.
You've got your cameras in the streets, and you've got the police coming in, guns a-blazing. You can hear the shooting going on quite frequently. What's it like to live there under those circumstances?
Well, to be completely honest, I had a fantastic time living there. I'm not going to try to glamorize it. There are some very negative sides of life in the favela. There are quite constant shootouts at times. I mean, the security situation there undulates quite ferociously. Like, sometimes you'll go to sleep with the rattling of machine guns on a nightly basis, and other times you'll go for months without hearing a single gunshot. So there is a huge ebb and flow of the security situation within the community. But on the other side, what I found was an extremely welcoming community. There was a real sense of community spirit there, and you feel that when you walk in, and I felt very welcomed from the outset. And I lived there for 14 months cumulatively over a 4-year period.
While you were making the documentary.
Yep.
4 years to make it. Monica, I think it's fair to say that probably most people have heard about the disappearance of Argentina, the disappearance of Chile. It was certainly news to me that thousands of people have been made to disappear in Brazil. I didn't know about it until I saw this documentary. You're from Rio. How much did you know about this?
Well, I knew quite a bit about this, and I'd like to congratulate Dan on this spectacular documentary. I was actually living in Rio when most of the events that the documentary talks about were taking place. I grew up in Rio. I lived most of my life there. My family lives in Rio. In fact, my mother lives very close to this specific slum that is documented, that is shown in the documentary. And I have a personal story about this because my grandmother, she lived in a neighborhood in Rio on a hillside that was over the years taken over by a slum. And my grandmother, she not only employed people from the community, so she had, her housekeeper was from the community that was kind of built up around her, but also, she had several friends in the community. And one thing that I remember very clearly from my childhood was, visiting my grandmother and seeing these police raids and having to, at my grandmother's house, sort of hide underneath the sofa or underneath the bed, because there was a lot of shooting going on. So I remember this very clearly, and yes, these things go on. They have continued to go on. I think what the documentary depicts, an event that took place right before the World Cup, and with respect to the disappearance of a construction worker in Rio and all the revolt that came out of that, that was really a turning point. That was when, for a lot of Brazilians and a lot of people that lived in Rio that perhaps weren't as close to this situation as I was during my childhood, this was something that really drove it home, the extent to which sometimes the police in Brazil is extremely truculent, but not only that, sometimes, it goes way beyond what it should be doing. Now, mind you, one thing that is interesting and that is very, striking also, is that a lot of the police force, the people who are actually raiding these communities, live in some of these communities. Not necessarily the ones that they're raiding, but they do live in these communities as well. So it's a bit of a paradox, that you see in a place like Rio.
Dan, let me follow up with you on that angle, because I think, again, in the Argentinian and Chilean examples, if you disappeared, basically you were dead. Now, when the police raid these places and take people away and then they disappear, do families ever find out what happens to them? What's the notion? What's happening here?
I think I can only speak to the community in which I had my personal experience of Rocinha, but particularly there is a climate of fear. Like, Amarildo is not the only person to disappear from there, and he won't be the last one. But I think more often than not, you'll find that if someone disappears, the family is far too terrified to speak out, to really, follow and chase justice. So more often than not, they'll stay silent, which is what made the case of Amarildo so special. Was the family actually really pushed and protested and fought for justice, and they had a clear impact on the fact that 25 police were arrested for his torture and murder.
What was his quote-unquote crime?
The police, in my view, believed that he had information about the drug traffickers in the community. So they picked him up. It was actually during an operation with a rather Orwellian name, Armed Peace. And it was essentially a big push to find traffickers, to find drugs, to find weapons. And this operation had been ongoing for a while, and they'd come up with nothing. So in my view, they got desperate. They found a member of the community who they thought might have known something about the traffickers. They picked him up and they tortured him to extract information. And as a result, he died. He was epileptic, so he couldn't withstand the torture, and he died. But it's not an isolated case. Before the disappearance of Amarildo, there was 22 other residents of Rocinha who actually went to a judge and with allegations of being tortured themselves, and the judge essentially threw it out. And these are the 22 that have actually come out and said something. So in my view, it's the tip of the iceberg.
Monica, I want to ask you about corruption. Financial, social, political, law enforcement. Does corruption simply run through all of Brazil's culture?
Yes, it does. In that sense, Brazil is no different from a lot of other countries around the world, but it is certainly true that corruption runs through everything. If you're caught if you're driving in the streets and you're, driving above the speed limit, there's a way for you, if you want to, break the law, there's a way for you always to bribe the police in order not to get a ticket. These sorts of things happen on a regular basis. So it's very ingrained. It's very much ingrained in the culture. And one thing I think that is striking about, and it's a positive about this whole thing that's taking place in the country right now, is that Brazilians are coming to grips with the fact that, the level that corruption has reached in Brazil is no longer tolerable. And one thing that I think made this really stand out was the infamous vote taken by the lower house a few weeks ago to impeach President Rousseff, where, a number of politicians who are allegedly implicated in this massive corruption probe were, getting up on the stand and basically giving speeches and giving their votes, but doing a lot of grandstanding. And many Brazilians who are watching this spectacle were actually shocked by what these politicians were doing. And that level of shock has made corruption the #1 issue identified in the polls in Brazil as being the most problematic issue that Brazil faces. Now, again, as I said, this is a positive because this potentially paves the way for corruption to become less ingrained in society as we go forward. But at this very moment, I would say that it is a culture that very much works with corruption.
Dan, I want to get your sense about how it is now. Your film takes place in the lead up to the World Cup in 2014, when all of the eyes of the world's soccer fans were on that country. That's going to happen again in this summer, as all of the eyes of the world in every sport look at Rio hosting the Olympics. Do you have any sense about whether or not the police intend to pacify large swaths of Brazilian society again as they're in the world spotlight?
Look, I'm aware that the pacification programs are continuing. You have to remember that Rio has, depending on which metric you choose to use, roughly 1,000 favelas, and they've only really pacified 30 or 40, and they just so happen to be in the touristic areas near where they would like to build infrastructure for the Olympics. But I think the problem of police corruption is just so systemic and so inherent that it can't not continue. Unless there's a massive overhaul of the system.
So we've got political corruption, we have financial corruption, we have social problems that are going off the charts right now, not to mention the Zika virus, which of course is an issue down there as well. Do you have any hope for Brazil's future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it has its problems, but it's also one of the most marvelous places I've ever been to in my life. It's my favourite country. So I can't not have hope. The people are fantastic people. They've got such a strong spirit, and I think the protests we're seeing and the fact that people are standing up and just saying, look, this is enough, we won't take it anymore. I have real optimism for the future. It won't be a fast or an easy process, but I think it's definitely moving in the right direction.
Monica, I'm told that we lose our satellite to you in 1 minute, so if you can summarize in a minute how hopeful you are, in spite of everything, about Brazil's future, I'd be grateful.
Well, I'm also pretty hopeful. I think the corruption scandal, the way that it's being handled within Brazil's constitution and within Brazil's judicial system, within its laws, within its legislation. It's coming out very much to the public, so it's raising a lot of public outcry in Brazil. And that whole thing sort of sets the stage for the country to build on this very dramatic and very tragic situation and emerge out of it a stronger and more equal democracy than it has been.
Perfectly done. Monica DeBully, we thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C. You're with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And Dan Jackson, we would certainly recommend your picture, In the Shadow of the Hill, to anybody. Have a look for, it was just playing at the Hot Docs Film Festival in Toronto, your website, intheshadowofthehill.com, will show where it is playing, presumably before it gets to television, and people can watch it there. It's really quite an excellent piece of work. Thanks so much to you both for coming on TVO with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.